Hi there. Today we're going to talk about the Japanese Edo period and the popular arts that were everywhere in the city of Edo. This place where the sort of exciting happenings came to be known as the floating world. And this is sort of the life and culture of the city that were burgeoning at this time. Merchants becoming wealthy, and the cities were growing larger. People were coming from the countryside and sort of joining in this new kind of wild devil-may-care world, a world where you can kind of reinvent yourself. And so this idea of a kind of popular culture sort of flourished in the Edo period, and great celebrities emerged, and there was a real excitement about what was happening in the city. There's also a kind of moral danger. We can see that characterized in this poem by Issa. In this world, we walk on the roof of hell and look at the flowers. So even though the floating world suggests a kind of euphoria, a kind of lack of attachment, that lack of attachment also, in a kind of negative way, reflected a kind of rejection of Confucian values of family and home and responsibility and virtue and all the things that kind of the glue that held people together. And so the floating world was this kind of sort of dangerous netherworld where people could go and have a good time, and really at the risk of their social status and their family standing. One of the more colorful characters that could be found in this floating world were these new rootless samurai, the Ronin, the masterless samurai who had been dishoused after the end of the Kamakura period, and they sort of wandered the city with a bit of pocket money and a deadly sword, and they dressed extravagantly, they flirted with ladies. They were, in a sense, very high-bred for their station, but they also were kind of outside the norms of polite society. And so they caroused around, got into fights, flirted with the geishas, and they become this very important sort of cultural center. You can see these people here, we called them kabuki because of their sort of twisted manner. The word kabuki literally means to be twisted, to have that sort of contorted way. You see this character here in the center, how he sort of leans on his samurai sword as he's sort of acting like he could care less about who he is or what he's about, in this sense where he's flirting with the ladies. And that sort of twisted posture and behavior was what made the kabuki so fascinating, these rootless, colorful Ronin samurai in the city of Edo. Now, initially, this floating world took place seasonally during the late fall, when the river would run dry in the center of the town, and temporary stages were constructed in this area. Eventually, a whole sort of district was created so that year-round people could go out into what was called the Yoshiwara. And this was really a kind of reclaimed swamp. So it was literally floating outside the boundaries of the city. And this is where all the sort of theater, the artists, the geishas, the sumo wrestlers, anybody who was anybody, and a lot of nobodies came to see and watch and ogle the sort of celebrity that was happening in this district. Artists were also a major part of this ukiyo-e culture, and they began to reflect their work in paintings. Now, this is a gold-gilt folding screen. So this would have been a very expensive work of art for someone to own, and would have been a part of kind of an elite status person, that they would have this screen that would kind of show their worldliness. So in their home, they might have this picture, which is not a picture of people of high status. It is not a picture of, important scenes and themes from Chinese culture. It is actually a sort of a depiction of these sort of courtesans and these kabuki, as we've mentioned earlier, who are hanging out. They're not poised for a picture. We're sort of peeking in on their wild ways. And there's a sense of undress. There's a casualness that is very disarming. It's not a formal portrait at all. And this is what people wanted to see. They wanted to kind of get this glimpse behind the scenes. And this is a very interesting thing, because if you think about it, this is sort of the idea of the Tosa school, that kind of peeking in on the elite of the Yamato clan. And here we have that same sort of looking down and at a remove from these characters. But these are not the elite of the Yamato clan. These are sort of everyday low-life characters. Some of them, celebrities in their own right. But nonetheless, they were not of any great status at court or elsewhere. And so this screen sort of sets them up as a kind of nobility, but it also represents them in a very realistic way. We get to kind of really see them in a way that was sort of the Kano treatment, where we're not looking at that sort of simplified, idealized people who were very generic in the Tosa school, but in fact we see a very lived life. This is how life actually happens. And so this is a really interesting kind of heady mix, this ukiyo-e style, these pictures of this floating world. And initially they were these very expensive, very elaborate paintings done on folding screens. So much of the early stuff we're going to be looking at are these kind of gold gilt folding screens. And much later, it will evolve into what people are more familiar with, the woodblock printed versions of this ukiyo-e. Now, I just want to point out one last thing about the Hikone screen. It was anonymous. And this is the earliest example we have of the ukiyo-e genre, as it is emerging early in the Edo period. And this is anonymous because the artist is probably a fairly high status artist and is doing this. He's not going to put his name on it. He's doing this for the money. It's not something that's a great deal of status involved in making this kind of art. And so when I talk about the way in which it is sort of Tosa in subject, Kano in handling, Tosa is this treatment of these characters as kind of nobility. The subject is people in this kind of looking down way. And the handling, the way in which they are expressive and vivacious and have real personalities and character, this is the Kano side of the ukiyo-e. Now, this genre of looking at everyday life had a kind of fancy name, rakuchu rakuku gaitsu, and this is this kind of way in which pictures of everyday life. And it's really amazing if you think about it. At this time, we have these incredible depictions of really what was happening down on the streets at this time. The artists were willing to sort of paint fairly realistically the dress, the customs, the manner, how people were just kind of getting together and hanging out. And so we have this wonderful picture of sort of everyday life of Edo Japan. So this is the sort of focus on the costume, the coloration, the life. Now, I love this detail of a folding screen. It shows a stage in the riverbed, and we see a performance taking place, and a number of the audience are sort of lounging about in their kimonos. But on stage, you'll notice a rather oddly dressed person is performing this kind of odd animal trick. He is dressed in Portuguese clothing. Now, if you remember, the Portuguese had arrived and had created a sensation. Well, here he is dressed in what must be the most exotic clothing around, the clothing of a foreigner. Furthermore, look at the two animals. He has a dog that's jumping through a hoop, but there's also this otter that's strangely dressed and has a fan in its mouth. Now, the otter is this wonderful caricature of this Ronin samurai kabuki, these twisted characters. You think about the otter with its small feet waddling onto the stage. Must have been how the kabuki themselves carried themselves, in this kind of twisted, wiggling manner. And so the otter here is a kind of parody of the kabuki Ronin in the Edo city. This idea of making fun of these kabuki characters, the Ronin samurai in the city, was picked up by a woman named Okuni. And she dressed up as this man and came and did a scene where she's sort of flirting with a prostitute. This was a huge hit. Okay, this was so phenomenally popular. This was a overnight sensation. Everyone was flocking to the river to watch Okuni swagger and flirt in this kind of sensual and sexy way. She was the most hottest ticket around that everyone wanted to see, and this became this new sensation. And it was called kabuki mono, meaning not kabuki, but mono meaning sort of playing at being a kabuki. Eventually they would drop the word kabuki, and what Okuni really create the mono, and so it would be called just kabuki, and Okuni would be sort of the original kabuki performer. Now, Okuni's performance was actually a kind of variation on the no stage, and we'll talk a little bit more about kabuki and its but you can see right there a kind of raised platform. We have musicians in the back, just like a no theater, and a lot of the dance that was brought on to stage initially was a kind of no theater dance that the Ronins would have been familiar with in their time at court. A number of imitators came about. This is Uneme. She's another woman who is now performing like a Ronin samurai, the kabuki. This particular one, you'll notice that she actually has a long rosary with a cross on it. She may or may not have been Christian at this time. Christianity had not yet been outlawed, so this might have been some sort of exotic apparel that she's wearing, or a kind of symbol to the changing times of the city of Edo. And so this way in which this sort of height of fashion, this kind of sexual play, flirting, dancing, this was what the original kabuki was all about, and this kind of cross-dressing, women dressing up as men. Well, this became an enormous sensation, and soon there were troops of women performers who were, like you see here in this one detail of this rakugaisu folding screen. We can see from the detail up there the river flowing through it. If you look up to the leftmost portion, you can see this detail is taken from there. It's a stage with this ring of women all dressed in a similar clothing. This is a big, fancy Busby Berkeley-esque number. And there's a woman in the center of the ring, star of the show, and she's got this crazy new instrument called the shamisen, which just came over from Korea. And so we have this newfangled musical instrument that was also really hot, and everyone was really excited about this thing. It was like the arrival of the electric guitar in the 1950s. And so this was this changes that were happening. Well, it was just too hot. It was just too popular. The city officials were outraged by the lawlessness and the chaos and the riots that were breaking out in the audience as these women paraded across the stage. And so they shut it down. They said women are no longer allowed to perform kabuki. That wasn't the end of kabuki, though. There had already been in the wings troops of young boys acting like women, acting like men. And so you had this wakushu kabuki. And this is also can be seen in a folding screen in the genre of rakuchu rakugaitsu. And this wakashu kabuki only lasted a few more years before it too was shut down. And for a brief period, there was no kabuki theater. And the theater manager said, listen, we have all these out-of-work actors. They're going to become lawless vagabonds. You got to give them a job. They're not good for anything else. Tell us how we can perform kabuki to your liking, and we will do it. And so the city officials came together and they decided we're going to create the most boring theater you can imagine. Only adult men can perform all the roles, and it must be a scripted theater, and we have to see the script before you perform it so that it gets approval. And they agreed to this. And this is what really would become this amazing theater form that is still around and quite popular today, the theater of kabuki. Now, as it moved later on to the Yoshiwara, they built these indoor theaters, and it gradually moved away from the kind of architectural ideas of no theater, and it really doubled down on spectacle. In fact, the sort of interaction with the audience became the whole thing. Sure, they had to write a script, but the actors diverted from the script in their performance. They made up lines. They did whatever they wanted to please the audience. And that's what makes kabuki so much fun to see. It is this extraordinary celebration of a performance meant to get you off your feet and get you excited about what's happening on stage. And it was full of spectacle and wonder and excitement. It was just a tremendous, some of the best theater I have ever seen has been kabuki performances. And so here we see this pathway running through the audience. This was a way to kind of engage in the audience and to make a grand entrance right through the theater. This is called the hanamichi, or flower pathway. It's a flower in the sense that it meant to be a gift. And so this was also a way in which actors could literally parade in front of their adoring fans, and they would throw gifts to them while they were on stage, and they would strike poses and strut around before they went in and did the business of actually performing in the play. And so this is what you can see is this transformation, these tea houses, foods being served, and this was just a really sort of exciting world of kabuki. Now, to advertise this, they began to make posters, woodblock print posters. And some of the earliest ones here would be printed on cheap paper and then sort of painted over, lacquered to preserve them so they could be outside without being destroyed. And they'd be hand painted. So it would be a black ink on a piece of paper, then hand painted. You would see the lead actors striking dramatic poses, and this became the earliest sort of ukiyo-e prints that began to sort of feature performers in a significant way. This becomes a really important way in which the kabuki sort of brings a lot of the energy and excitement to the world of ukiyo-e. Here we see a multicolored print. Nishiki depicts the actor Sawamura Sojiro III by Utagawa Toyokuni I. Now, actors belong to families, and important actors would pass down their roles and their special tricks and their audiences to their own children. And it became a way in which actor families now can be multiple generations. Some of the great actors today, Ichikawa Danjiro, I think is on the 13th or 14th generation, maybe even more at this point. But this is a part of this way in which they bring about this excitement. Also notice now it's no longer hand painted. The technology has been developed to make these multicolored prints. These are called nishiki-e. And this was going to be more expensive, but clearly there was a desire to create flashier, more spectacular images. Now, the gray background you see in this particular picture, this actually would have been reflective mica. So it would have been this kind of silvery, mirror-like, shimmering image that would have just added to the spectacle of the actor print. Now, men playing female roles. This was probably the most difficult part to play. And actors who specialized this played only women. They had to have a special costume, certain body, and they cultivated this. Many of them maintained their female dress even off stage. It became a part of their persona. It became a part of the way in which they cultivated their audiences. Now, if you look at this performance here, you'll notice that he has this sort of red scarf that's covering over the forelocks. This is a pretty clear indication that this is an onagata and not an actual woman. This scarf is covering over, which is a shaved pate. Adult men in the city of Edo were required to shave their forelocks. And so the only way you knew that an actor was male was that they had that shaved pate. One of the concessions they were able to get for performing kabuki was that men could wear a silk scarf over their shaved pate as a kind of way in which that it sort of hid the fact that they had this bald head. Otherwise, they would have been just so unattractive. It would have been very difficult to play a female role in any capacity. And so this red scarf over the forelock is what you often see for the onagata, the men performing women's plays. Here are some really spectacular actor portraits. Here's the actor Ichikawa Ibijiro by Yoshikuni. And he's striking a dramatic pose. And this is what the actors were most famous for. This is called a mie. An actor comes on stage, they take a few steps, and the audience is just amazed by their appearance, and they kind of draw together their energy, and they cross their eyes, and they stomp their feet, and they make this dramatic pose that says, "I have arrived. This is my character." Now, you'll notice that the actors on stage, they wore special costumes. Their costumes also had their family crest on them. And so this is something that, the actor, no matter what role they're playing, their family name was on their clothing, this thing called the mon. And so it becomes this way of sort of presenting themselves both as a character, but always identifiable by their family and who they were, trying to sort of give them that sort of popular appeal to their personality. Notice the way in which Hokushu does the actor Nakamura Utemon III. He does this, again, this mie pose. He makes the head seem like it's kind of hovering off the body, projecting out in this kind of striking, cross-eyed look. Now, this is an incredibly complicated picture here, this sort of swirling background. The foreground, the simple wood planks, is very bare, but then the background behind the actor is this screen, which has at least 5 or 6, and it reveals a whole series of characters behind that smoke screen veil, sort of hovering in the wings. So just an absolutely beautiful and incredibly complex image. So just to create the grid pattern that sort of comes down between them in that swirling clouds, that would have been one block of wood that was all just vertical lines and one block of wood that was all just horizontal lines. They also did it a tremendous way of bringing out the character of the wood itself in what's called kimetsu tsubuchi, this way in which the wood that's being printed on the ink would be applied in such a way that the grain would kind of pop out and print on the image. And so this is meant to look like a kind of Buddhist gift box, a kind of prayer box here that would have this special scrolled edges, and yet it would have this just absolutely stunning wood grain to make it feel like you're aware of the fact that this is a woodblock print. Now, aside from kabuki, the other great theater that was quite popular during the Edo period, I just have to mention because it is so celebrated at the time, is called bunraku. Now, bunraku is an incredibly complicated puppet theater. There's a separate narrator who reads all the character roles from the script, and then you have 3 puppeteers to each puppet. There's one person who controls the head and the right arm, another person who controls the left arm, and another person who operates the feet. And so if you have even an intimate scene here between 2 puppets, there are actually 6 puppeteers on stage. And they have to coordinate all their movements to create this sort of delicate, intimate moments. Initially, bunraku was famous for its history plays, such as the Battle of Koxinga. This is a famous play by the playwright Chikamatsu Monzaemon. Chikamatsu began working in the kabuki theater, but he was disgusted by the fact that the actors kept going off script. They kept kind of doing whatever they wanted on stage. And so he went to the bunraku theater. And so the most celebrated playwright of this time moves to the puppet theater because he feels like they respect his script and the integrity of his script. And what's amazing is Chikamatsu Monzaemon, he doesn't just do these sort of heroic battles of samurai, such as the battles of Koxinga. He actually does this other kind of more intimate stories called seiwamono, these domestic plays, where you see these families torn apart by rivalries and jealousies, and a man has fallen in love with a courtesan who is being bought by some wealthy merchant, and he, a penniless man who's out on his luck, can only sneak around in the shadows. He can never fully enjoy her company. And so this is the sort of drama that Chikamatsu Monzaemon was really exceptionally well known for. So you're going to the Yoshiwara, you want to be introduced to what's happening in the culture of the floating world, you would buy a guidebook, like The Mirror of Yoshiwara, 1659. And in it you would see all the celebrities, their hangouts, and you would see the kind of clothing they were wearing. This became another important venue for the woodblock prints. People went to the Yoshiwara to get up on the latest fashions, to see the styles of clothing. And they wanted these images so they could take them back to their tailor in town and say, make me a kimono like this. And so we see the kimono designs of the Yoshiwara sort of infiltrating every part of Japanese society. And characters like the onagata, the men playing women's roles, they were really the leaders of the fashion industry at this time. But there were also a popular genre called bijinga, beauty prints, pictures of, beautiful courtesans that you could find, and you could sort of admire their beautiful clothing and hairstyles. So this is a print by Kitagawa Utamaro, who's famous for his bijinga. And this is a really fascinating print because it's called Three Contemporary Beauties in 1793. In it, he represents 3 different women of 3 different classes, Toyohina, Okita, and Ohisa. So Toyohina was a very high-class courtesan, a geisha, and a celebrated musician. Okita was a little less. She was just a waitress at a tea house in Naniwaya. And Ohisa, on the left, she was just an adolescent girl who served patrons at her father's soy cracker bake shop. These three women are being put together in the same picture and represented as what it means to be beautiful. That beauty is not a class thing. This is not something that these women have inherited. This is not something that they own. It is a gift that has come to them regardless. And this is the thing that makes the Yoshiwara so interesting, is the way in which kind of breaks down the classes, that people go there and the sort of mingling of the samurai and the merchants and the elites, the royalty. All of these people were kind of sneaking around in the Yoshiwara. And this is part of what made it so exciting. You never know who you're really bumping into. And this picture really captures this idea of this kind of fluid, floating world that celebrates beauty. Here's another beauty print by Kitagawa Utamaro. It was one where it's about sewing. You see this woman inspecting the hem of a garment. She's clearly a geisha, caught in a moment where she is focused on something else. We're sort of peering in her private quarters. Her child is there. And it's just beautiful the way she's holding up the fabric, and her face is veiled in this kind of seductive way. We're allowed to sort of peek in, and the way the framing of the cloth exposes her sensual neck and her foot. And so there's this way in which there's sort of sexuality, this sort of unintended glimpses of this world that we are just passing through. Clothing is the body, and the kimono becomes the subject of the body. There isn't a lot of nudity in the sexuality that we see. We see a lot of sort of suggestion of sensuality through the treatment of the kimono. And this is wonderfully characterized in a genre of folding screens called tagasude. This whose sleeves is what that translates as, meaning we're looking at a rack of garments, and a few of them have just been tossed on there. Like a male and female kimono have been thrown off with such a rush that the owners are no longer concerned about hanging them up properly. So maybe behind the screen or somewhere out of view, something really wild and naked is happening. And all we can see is this sort of tumult of kimonos on this hanging rack. And it's this idea that the kimono is the body. The kimono is still there representing what is really happening just out of view. This sexuality, this sensuality, was a genre that was very popular in the Edo period, in the Ukiyo-e. People wanted to see the geishas and the samurai and this flirting nature. This was the whole subject of the kabuki originally. And these pictures, shunga, spring pictures, were thought of as a kind of access to the sort of intimate worlds that were happening just out of view. Hishikawa Moronobu was one of the early artists who was able to really capture this. You can see a kind of hand-painted version of this shunga world. We get a folding screen there, and so again, we're kind of looking down on the scene, peering into this event that we really wouldn't be privy to. This is what we call this sort of voyeurism, a kind of peeping Tom way of kind of looking into what's going on in the floating world. Okumura Masanobu was another artist, and he was one who really created some of the earliest of these multi-color prints. Shunga was a kind of driver for new innovation in the industry. People wanted flashier, sexier, wilder imagery, and they wanted more colorful. And so multicolored prints became the mainstay. This sort of urushi, this early multicolored prints, were sort of the mainstay of the shunga genre. Ukiyo-e was always a kind of world of fantasy, a world of of unchecked desires. And here we see these two young girls dreaming of going off with this young man, walk in the wilderness, and this auspicious and slightly sexual image of Mount Fuji sort of rising in the background, this way in which it's meant to fertility and a sense of harmony. I point this out because this image of a dream is encapsulated, a picture within a picture. And you'll notice how it's like a speech bubble. The tail of it sort of winds back and points to the neck of the sleeper, this sort of vulnerable part that's sort of revealing their innermost secrets. Now, these sort of speech bubble-esque glimpses into the dream world, this is actually a manner of representing dreams that doesn't originate in Japan. It comes over from China and the popular prints that were happening there. And so this is part of the way in which there's a kind of drawing in of some of the iconography and the symbolism of Chinese popular prints in Japan as well. Utamaro, the lovers, the sensuality and the sexuality, they're sort of tumbling out of the scene. There's this big stretch of leg, and there's this wild, sexy twist of kimonos that's going on. There's a sense of urgency and, trying desperately to stay hidden in this picture by Utamaro. And this is what makes it so wonderfully dramatic and exciting, this sort of power and intimacy and sensuality of the picture. Now, one of the challenges that publishers of the woodblock prints had was some prints were popular, some prints were less so. They would create a print and it may sell or it may not. And so one of the ways in which the publisher was able to kind of get more prints sold is they would bundle them together. They would say, oh, well, we have a dozen prints. You're not going to just get one, you'll get a dozen. And so they could up the price, not as expensive as buying 12 individually, but it also meant that they could have a variety of images out there and that they wouldn't have this kind of popular and unpopular prints. They could sort of group them together. After grouping them together, they began to give them themes. And then eventually this group of images had a story to tell. And this is one of the very first narrative groups of shunga images that was created in woodblock print. And I tell you this because it's sort of a roundabout way of getting to what's essentially a comic book. No, it's not entirely a modern comic like manga that we would talk about today. It's still a kind of one scene and then another scene and then another scene, but it is an extraordinary image. This is the last panel of a series of episodes where we have the adventures of the horny Manimon, who is a guy who has gone on a trip to the Yoshiwara to see all the great lovers. And so on his way, he makes a prayer to the goddess of love, and she appears before him, and she grants his wish. He says, you can go see and witness all the great lovers of Yoshiwara, and to do that, I will make you really small. And so Manimon is made into this little person, and you can see him up in the tree on the upper left. And in this scene, he's sort of peering in on this pair of lovers. You have a geisha and her assistant, and her client is groping her assistant. This is a very, very bad moment, and everybody is looking very awkward and a little put off. In fact, they all look like they smell something of a stink. And that's because up in the tree, you can see there Manimon lifting his little kimono and farting. And a little jet of air is coming out the back. Okay? So this is funny. This is sexy. This is weird. And this is what was popular at this time, this kind of new storytelling that was made possible through the genre of shunga. So Suzuki Harunobu, he sort of creates this. This proved so popular, there was actually even a second episode, Further Adventures of Minimon in the Yoshiwara. Soon enough, within 10 years, publications began to appear, and ones that were really popular were called Kibyoshi, little yellow books. And it ran from 1775 to 1806. And the first one we have is Koika Harumachi, River of Love and the Town of Spring. And already the sort of sensuality and sexuality of these stories was very apparent. They were fantastic, they were outrageous, and they became really popular, these little storybooks that people wanted to see. Here we go back to look at another dream sequence. An ordinary man, Master Flashgold, has this splendiferous dream. And you can see in this panel how the dream bubble is kind of enveloping him, reading from right to left, how this palanquin has arrived and is going to take him off on this tour of a palace. And so this ordinary man, and you can see in the background there's actually this rice pounder, this wonderfully sexual image that's right above his head. So these are kind of smart, sexy, funny things. The other thing I want to point out here is look how the language just completely covers over the page. Every little inch is covered with language in this kind of jumble of words and images. And that's what also made it fun. Unlike that sort of spare, poetic look of the sort of the elite arts, this crazy-making chaos jumble of words and pictures just made it more fun and exciting. Now I want to go through one of the stories of the Kibyoshi, quickly sort of tell you something about this particular one that's actually been translated. It's a wonderful translation. You can read for yourself. Playboy Roasted a la Edo, written and illustrated by Kyoden. Now, in this story, we have this character, Injiro, who is the only son of the tycoon owner of a butchery shop. And so he's got some money and not a lot of sense. And he sits around reading Kibyoshi, dreaming about having sexual adventures just like the heroes in his favorite stories. And since he's got money, he starts to hire people to act out all these sort of exploits. So here we have a Kibyoshi that's a story about somebody wanting to be in a Kibyoshi. It's a meta story, meaning it's a story where we become aware of the genre itself. And that's why I'm telling this to you, because it's a great introduction to what was sort of typically happening in these stories. And it's also a great introduction to the sort of self-referential way in which these stories had this kind of fun, intellectual, playful, sexy mix-up. So in this story, he hires a town crier to come and read about his sexual exploits. And of course, they're giving it away free, and even still, people don't believe it. And in many ways, he's also had hired all these little girls to act like they're geisha's assistants to come and drag him back to the Yoshiwara, pretending that her lover is angry that he's been away for so long. So again, he's sort of play acting this role from what would have been a typical scene in Kibyoshi. He hires guys to pretend to beat him up, so of a jealous lover, and he also decides in this final performance as a lover of inside a Kibyoshi, he is going to perform his own suicide. Love suicides were a popular feature going back to bunraku, and I mentioned bunraku, the puppet theater, just recently. Bunraku theater was the way in which people often saw these stories about love suicides. Kabuki also picked up on the popularity of this. It would be a pair of star-crossed lovers who cannot live in this world because they can't afford to live outside of the Yoshiwara as courtesans, and so they come and decide to kill themselves. And there's this whole sort of romance of seppuku. Remember, seppuku was something that was the preview of the samurai. And the samurai at court were appalled that these merchants and actors were playing at seppuku. It was to them the most insulting thing that this was a part of the theater, and they were really kind of banned from the theater very quickly. But of course, banning them made it all the more attractive. So Injiro hires this woman to play act his death, and while they're out in the wilderness performing their idea of a ritual suicide, two bandits come in and threaten to really kill them. And they beg for their lives. And the bandits steal their clothes, and they are forced to return home naked and ashamed. And so what's so funny about this, it's a sort of reverse lover suicide, that instead of their journey to the place where they will kill themselves becomes this kind of romantic journey to the place. Instead, it's this kind of retreat from the place of illusion and the sort of return to ordinary life. And I love the way in which there is a glimpse of a torii gateway in the background, as if they are coming from the world of the sort of Shinto deities and the spirit world, and they're coming back into the real world. They've kind of passed that gate, and they're moving from right to left back into the real world. So, Kibyoshi was enormously popular, but it dies out. And why did it die out? Some people say the reason that Kibyoshi did not continue on into the modern world was that it was opposed by powerful samurai, and that there were these Kensei reforms in 1787 and 1793 that were kind of wide-ranging ways in which the shogun was trying to reassert control of the populace in the city. And one of them was sort of outlawing these Kibyoshi, were considered kind of too licentious and too political. Many of these stories were getting rather political. And so Kibyoshi was sort of on the outs by the higher ups. But that didn't directly kill it, because it continues on for almost 10 years after that. Really, what might have changed it more importantly was that Kibyoshi's frivolity and character was really dated, and that by 1806 its popularity had waning as people wanted, longer format narratives with more serious themes and ideas, the idea of vendettas and the humor books that were more clearly funny. This sort of ironic, self-referential material didn't really hold on an audience interest for very long. And so Kibyoshi, though it's very close to what we would call a comic book, it had dialogue, it had action, it had pictures in a series, it told a story. It's not, okay? And if you want to know the real subtle technical differences there, it doesn't quite become a comic book just yet. That would arrive another 100 years later with the arrival of Western comics and what would then eventually be called manga, okay? We'll get to that later.